I have a wonderful presentation
By Reggie.
by Richard and his friend, whose
Yes.
name is
This is Norman.
Norman.
The name will become
Welcome,
apparent
Norman.
as we go through. I was going to play the Dam Busters music for you, Alan. Sorry.
Do that, yeah.
Why not?
Bring to it
Why
at the
not?
end. There's 8 minutes of music to play at the end.
Absolutely.
Right.
Let's start off.
makeup.
Yes, lights.
No makeup. Sorry. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I've got the thing here, haven't I? Super duper. So thanks very much everybody for coming. Tonight I'm going to give you a brief chat on, it's going to be about an hour. We could have a break halfway through if people start to drop off. Hopefully you won't. We've got tea and coffee for afterwards. If we could leave any questions until afterwards, as I said, tea and coffee, and I'm more than happy to talk about some of the little items and the bigger items that I brought with me. I'm going to share with you a story about a poem that I found. If anybody gets uncomfortable with seeing a grown man shedding a tear about his mother, then I suggest you leave now, because at some stage this evening I will. I'm guaranteed to. I do every time I do this. Basically, this comes down to this beautiful young woman, Jean Sweet, my mother Jean Gibson, as she was when she was married, who in 1944 was working at the tax office in Birmingham. She used to walk down she lived in Smethwick, and she used to walk down the Hagley Road, which is the main road going into Birmingham. As you come off the M5, it's junction 3 for the 456, which I always think is a nice, easy junction to remember. And the Hagley Road divides Birmingham into 2 bits on the west. You've got Smethwick to the top, which isn't the nicest of areas. Underneath is Harborne, and this is the sort of property you had in Harborne. And the tax office records were moved out to Harborne during the war. So Mum gaily tripped down the road through Harborne to this property every day to spend time with her best friend. I'll just share one story. Mum used to share stories with me every day when we went shopping on a Saturday. And it'd be the same stories every week, as old people do. But they got ingrained into me about the threepenny bus ride to the Bourneville factory, because her stepbrother worked in Cadbury's before the war. And whilst he was in the services, she would get the threepenny bus, get the chocolate ration from Bourneville, and because he used to work there, she'd get a bag of scraps as well. And of course the bag of scraps would be given to her stepmother, who would go to the butcher and get an extra ration of bacon, etc. But the other fantastic thing about working in the tax office was doing the night shift. Now, as a civil servant, working for HM Revenue and Customs, we lock the doors before you run out. If anybody suggested to me that I was going to do a night shift, I'd balk. But if Mum was doing a night shift, she could take a rolled up towel with her, because they had big baths in this house, and you were allowed to run yourself a bath, which you couldn't do at home. And in the morning, a chap with a gammy hand, I don't know why Mum remembered that so clearly, but this chap used to arrive from the baker's with a fresh loaf of bread. So for breakfast, they would have big chunks of bread with as much butter as they wanted. So it was real luxury. I include a small bit of a letter there, because Mum, bit of backstory, born in 1926 in Shanghai, in China. She was the daughter of a missionary, somebody who worked for the Baptist mission in China. And that letter was written just a few days after Mum was born, and a few days before her mother died. So as a young babe, my mother was literally shipped back to the UK. And she spent the first 8 years of her life living in an idyllic existence with her mother's 2 sisters. And I keep referring to her as my mother's mother, because I never referred to her as my grandmother, so I never knew her. But she spent the first 8 years with these 2 old spinsters in Devon, idyllic lifestyle. And one day, whilst visiting Birmingham, she was left there. She was left there with her father's side of the family, her father who basically didn't want to have the baby in the household, so shipped her back to the UK. Mum didn't have a particularly good time in Birmingham. Sorry, this is a bit more of a backstory than I intended doing. We know for a fact that her stepmother kept most of the money that my mum earned. In fact, after she got married, there were some scolding letters from her stepfather to my mother saying, "Where's all this money that we've been asking you for?" we put up with you for so many years. Do you know how much money we spent on you? The least you can do is give us some of. She was actually sending her wages back to back to the family, but her stepmother wasn't telling her stepfather that she was sending the money back, and she was pocketing the money for herself. So my mum during the war had nothing, literally nothing. So when her best friend Mary said, "Well, it's my 18th birthday next year." It was Mum's 18th birthday in 1944. "Will you come to my 18th birthday party now?" An 18th birthday party in Harborne in Birmingham. That was going to be a top party. And, said Mary, my brother John's coming. And he's bringing his Lancaster bomber crew. So, Mum thought, well, what can I give Mary? She didn't have any money. So, she wrote a poem. Now, one of these Saturday mornings, I sorted Mum out, had the kettle on, helping her put her slippers on, looking around for all the pills that were scattered around the armchair where she lived. She was on her own at the time. This was about 2017. And I noticed a small exercise book on the coffee table next to her. I said, "Oh, Mum, what's this little book?" She said, "Oh, it's my book of poems." I said, "Oh, really? I didn't know you had a book of poems, Mum." And it was stuffed full of poems about me, about my children, about my father, and about her family, and about church. She was a regular church goer. And this one, entitled "In Tribute to a Gallant Crew from a Grateful British Subject." I said, "Mum, that's not the sexiest of titles for a poem, is it?" She said, "Well, no." And she explained about the fact that there was going to be an 18th birthday party. So she wrote this poem to give to the to present to the crew at the party. But she said the Lancaster bomber crashed before I could actually read the poem to them. Okay, I put the poem away. I took a quick photograph, in fact, took a quick video of Mum reading the poem to me, and then put it away, and forgot about it. Got on with looking after Mum, got on with our lives. We moved to Hereford. Mum died in 2018, which is why we ended up moving to Hereford, because we had the money to move somewhere nicer than sunny Cwmbran in South Wales. So we actually moved abroad. Say to most people, we moved abroad. What? France? No, England. Right. Okay. So in 2020, I was looking for some photographs for another occasion, amongst all the millions of photographs I've got, not thinking about this at all, because the iPhone that I had, that I'd taken the photograph, that I'd taken the video of, when I was doing some work on the Jeep that I own, those of you know I've got my World War II Jeep, I could see my fleece falling off the side of the shelf straight into the vat of dirty engine oil. The phone was completely ruined, so I didn't think there was any chance of ever seeing this again. So when I came across this, I thought, brilliant. Now, I wonder if, because Mum never delivered the poem to the crew, I could do a bit of research and do that myself. So I'll read you the poem. In fact, no, I won't read you the poem. I'll get somebody else to read the poem to you. Come on, here we are. Oops, hold on. Sorry, Mum. I've not turned the sound on, have I? That would help. There we go. Let's hope it's not going to be too loud. Let's try that again. No, it's not working. Oh, sorry, folks. Oh, rats. There's no power. Why is there no power? Because it's not plugged in.
Oh, rookie
Oh,
error.
it's modern science. Right, let's try this again. Come on. Sorry, folks. Let's just see.
It's true.
Oh, there we are.
Until all
Right,
this,
okay.
It's gone now, Reg.
Right.
Johnny and Norman, the Baron and Joe, Corny and Dinger and
Right. Sorry, folks.
Johnny and Norman, the Baron and Joe.
Mum, wait. Right, let's have a look. What's happened to this?
I think it's when you no, it went off when you moved the lead.
Yeah.
On your phone.
No, it's this. That's,
No, it's the lead. It was the lead when he moved the.
right, let's have a look. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, this is you again. You're on duty again.
Yeah, it's that. Why is that not working? Ah, there we are. You have power. Sorry, folks. Right, let's Yes, again. Green light. There. Come on. You can do it. Talk amongst yourselves.
Pardon? Yeah.
Power, it says power, yep. It's flashing. It'll get there eventually. Sorry about this, folks.
So he's having to put the heating on at home,
Yeah, it certainly does, yeah.
Ellen?
Turned it right down.
I might have to
Did you
reset
switch
this.
it off with the phone?
No, it was the wire, Alan. It
Right,
just-
it just seemed to go, yeah. I,
It was the
Right.
one.
Here we go. Laptop's on. So this is my IT consultant, Ian.
Yeah, so
Here we are, we're off.
When it works, it'll be there.
Right. Come on. Yay! Round of applause. Okay, let's just make sure that is focused. Yeah, there we go. Right, so, as I said, I'd read you the poem, but I've got somebody else who can read the poem for you.
Johnny and Norman, the Baron and Joe, and Corny and Dinger and George are all in a bomber on every big show. Their way through the flak they will forge. By Mavis Duchesne is the Lancaster's name. It means what we think, you're the tops. Norm will pilot you through. John will aim his bombs true until all this monstrosity stops. And if they're hit by the flak, there is no turning back. They go on till the job has been done. And with all guns ablaze, they'll have put out the maze of searchlights with the Baron's rear gun. When wounded and torn, feeling slightly forlorn, the bomber leaped back with its crew. George will rest careful and tend every fresh battle wound, till once more they can fly in the blue. Then with Dinger and Joe, Corny completing the crew, the cream of our land is displayed. We humble ourselves when we think of the courage and sacrifices they have made.
Well done, Jean. So, I thought, how difficult is this going to be? Using modern social media, can I find the families? And one of the Facebook groups, one of the Bomber Command forums, suggested I went to the Bomber Command losses database. It's a fabulous resource where you can put in any name and it'll tell you whether, what position they were in, who they were flying with, etc. So I thought, right, okay, well, we've got a Norm, there's a George, there's a Johnny, there's a Joe. Dinger and Corny are mentioned. I thought, those aren't very common names. So I put in Dinger. No. Right, okay. Corny. No. Different spelling. No. I thought, I wonder if this is possibly just a flight of fancy of a 17-year-old girl in the middle of war-torn Birmingham comes up with the idea of writing a poem and presents it to me as a story. So I was a little bit disillusioned. But in the background, I didn't realise that one of the researchers from the International Bomber Command Centre, Di Ablewhite, was actually saw this and took it upon herself to start doing some more research. And Di's very kindly penned a couple of words for us.
Have you ever read a post on social media that touched you so much it moved you to take action? Roughly 5 years ago, I came across a poem that did just that. On the 16th of July 2020, a gentleman shared the most beautiful poem that was written by his mother in 1943. As a keen researcher, particularly when it comes to Bomber Command history, This request was one I simply could not ignore to try and solve. The post read as follows. I have a huge ask. I posted about my uncle the other day. He was RAF during the war. Well, at the same time, my mum was a teenager in Birmingham. A work colleague was having her 18th birthday, and Mum was quite excited to hear that her friend's brother would be there with his Lancaster crew. Inspired, Mum wrote the following ditty to present to them at the party. Unfortunately, by the time of the party, the crew had been lost. The poem sat in a book of poems for years until we found it, not long before her death a couple of years ago. Can anyone identify the Lancaster and the crew from the detail in the poem? A long shot, I know, but any help would be gratefully received. Reg Gibson. All day I kept thinking about it, how lovely it would be to know who she'd meant those words for. I only had my phone, so I knew I couldn't even try and find an answer till I got back home. So I took a screenshot to look in detail when I got back. In theory, it seemed pretty straightforward. She'd named all of the crew, but what soon became apparent was some were obviously nicknames, not actual names, and I could find no surname for Dinger or Corney. This would take a little more investigating than I imagined. The crew were lost sometime between 1943 and 1944, and within this crew, the only names I could be 100% sure of were a pilot named Norman, a bomb aimer called John, and that there would be a George and a Joe somewhere in the team. Then I had the extra challenge of trying to find names where Dinger, Corney and Baron could fit a possible nickname. My first stop was the International Bomber Command Centre Losses database. First I searched for the Christian name Norman, 686 of them. Then I narrowed it down with aircraft type. The poem said it was a Lancaster. We were down to 264. Then I reduced it to a time frame between 1943 and 1944. I was down to 217 of them. Sadly, at that time, it wasn't possible to narrow down the trade to pilot, so I had to look at all 217 entries. If Norman was not a pilot, I simply moved on. 2 days later, several pilot Normans turned up, but none with the other crew names in the right position. Searching all 1943 resulted in nothing close. But then in January 1944, a pilot named Norman with a bomb aimer called John. My hours of research had started to pay off. I was hopeful. I saw that another crew member was named Bell. Could that be Dinger? And another called Wheatstone. Could that be Corney? They all seemed to fit apart from Baron. I wasn't 100% sure, but another ray of hope was that one of the crew was from Birmingham, near to where the author of the poem lived. So I replied to the original message, saying there was a chance that this was the crew, but we needed firm proof to be sure. As one of the volunteers researchers of the International Bomber Command Centre, myself and Reg set about trying to find the relatives of this crew, in the hope that one of them had a letter or some recollection of the use of these nicknames. Together we constructed the airman's family tree and found hopeful contacts for 6 out of the 7 families. Reg made contact and we have been provided with some wonderful photos from that time, including 2 crew photos. Then came a huge breakthrough. Reg had a reply from John Stanley's niece, the airman that had lived in Birmingham. John Stanley's sister should have had her 18th birthday party in April 1944, and John should have been there with his crew, and so he would have heard the poem. She also confirmed that her aunt knew Jean through work. To our relief, the final piece fell into place, and we were finally able to share this gift with them. The families of the crew have now heard the poem that was meant to be a surprise at the party that sadly never happened. Tragic events overtook. Lest we forget.
So that's somebody who basically gave her 2 days just to go through row upon row upon row upon row of entries and eventually identified the crew. You can see this is the result from the IBC database, and it shows that in addition to Norman West, the pilot, you've got Dinger Bell. Anybody in the forces would know, of course it's Dinger Bell. Crikey, what else do you call Bell? You've got George Powell, John Joey Smith, you've got John Stanley, George Upfold, and Cyril Wheatstone. Corny Wheatstone. And from the RAF records, for each mission that's flown in the RAF, you have an operations record book, an orb, and it details who was flying in the aircraft. And you can see here that the captain was Norman West, the navigator, Arthur Bell, WT is wireless telegrapher. It's actually an air gunner wireless telegrapher. It's a dual role, and that's Cyril Wheatstone. The air bomber, AB, was John Stanley. FE is flight engineer, George Powell. MU is mid-upper gunner. He's the chap that sits in the middle at the top. That's Joey Smith. The rear gunner was Sergeant George Upfold. So for those of you who aren't familiar with a Lancaster bomber, there's a model of one over there. I'll just point out where these various positions are. Starting at the front, you've got the bomb aimer who has the perspex front and perspex floor, so you can see where they're going to be dropping the bombs together with his computer. The pilot sits in the front in this big perspex roof. Next to him is the flight engineer who's keeping an eye on all of the engines to make sure they're running as well as they could do, making sure there's sufficient fuel, etc. And then behind is the navigator, who has to be in close contact with the pilot to give instructions. He sits behind a little screen, a little curtain, so that he can read the maps without any light escaping. And then behind that is the wireless operator, who didn't really do much after they'd taken off or until they got back. It was a fairly quiet role in between. But he did double as an air gunner, and he could take on any of the other crew's positions. Here's the mid-upper gunner, that little perspex dome up there with some guns. This is a very early Lancaster with a gun that went underneath, but they abandoned that pretty soon. And that's where Joey Smith sat. And all the way back here, here's the doors where they enter the aircraft. Everybody went right, except for one person, and that was the rear gunner. To keep these wings together, you've got the main spar of it running there, so he'd have to crawl over that, put his legs through. There's a double door in the back of his compartment, which he'd have to open, and he'd climb in there, close the door behind him. If there was any issue with a Lancaster and they had to bail out, they'd have to put the parachutes on, because they didn't wear them. They were such cramped conditions they couldn't wear their parachutes, and they would have to clip them onto these hooks on the front. Then you could jump out. The rear gunner had to open his doors again. He had to climb out. He had to get his parachute, put it back on, climb back over the spar, go through his doors, close the doors behind him, and then he'd spin the turret round so that those doors were facing outwards. He'd open the doors and roll backwards out the back of the aircraft. And that was how he escaped. Down here, there was an escape hatch in the floor here, so the bomb aimer and the pilot could get out, and the main door was down here for the mid-upper gunner. So one of the major faults about a Lancaster is once things went wrong, you imagine trying to get all that, getting your parachute on, and then getting out of an aircraft that's probably doing this at the time. So, let's see if we can find some of the relatives of the crew. Now, Cyril wasn't the first family that I got in touch with, but it was the first time that I had a face-to-face meeting with somebody. It was actually a WhatsApp video call with Cyril's relatives. Now, this is something that Di was very quick to actually produce, family trees. The amount of stuff that she had access to, the various ancestry websites, etc., and software to create these things. And you can see Cyril up here. There he is. Cyril Wheatstone, married to Marjorie Mather. Now, when you do this sort of research with so many of the Facebook groups that you go to, people say, oh, I'm looking for my brother's cousins, uncles, stepbrothers, all these distant relatives. But here, if you notice, Cyril and Marjorie have a son. Because at the time Cyril died, Marjorie was pregnant. So, got hold of Ben Challicum, who's a doctor in London, who's married to Sarah Wheatstone. She kept the family name, who then put me back up in touch with Keith. And I had a fantastic conversation with him. Halfway through the conversation, he said, so you've seen the photographs of the crew, haven't you? I said, no. And he brought up this photograph. Now, it was a much poorer quality photograph that you just taken with this phone. But it's a superb, you know, portrait of the 7 young men from that Lancaster. And on the end is Cyril. So we've got our first name, brilliant. He said, we've seen the other photograph. And Di, when she said, what do you mean 2 photographs? To have 2 photographs of the crew is really unusual. And he produced this one. This is the one either on the way to the mess or the way back from the mess. Never sure. But they all look like they've had a good scrub up. And that's Cyril, second from the right. So we've got to try and identify who the rest of the crew are. But here's Cyril anyway. Cyril Frederick Corney Wheatstone, wireless operator. He was married to Marjorie, I think it was. It was funny that Di Ablewhite, her maiden name was something like Cornwall, and all of her friends in school called her Weetabix. And so she could see that link straight away. That probably is Corny. Cyril's unfortunately the only member of the crew who hasn't got a grave in Germany, because they only recovered 6 bodies from the crew, from the aircraft. So he's commemorated on the Runnymede Memorial just outside Reading. And I went down there last summer and found the plaque where his name is mentioned, and there he is. And I was found a conversation I'd had with Keith, his son, and he said that his grandparents took him to the opening of the memorial in 1953. And so he said, I have been there, but it was a while ago. So he would have been a 10-year-old. Cyril was 22 years old, and that's the sobering thing with all of these crew members, apart from one. It's just quite shocking how young these young men were. Power of Facebook, again, I was looking through, as you do, some of the photographs that come up, and I spotted at the back, you see this is a graduation photograph for these wireless telegraphers. He's even got his brand new wooden boots. It's high summer clearly, but he's got his new boots tucked underneath his arm there. Chappell's wearing his boots in the back. And in the back there, can you see? It's Cyril Wheatstone. A photograph the family hadn't seen. So it's a delight to actually add something to this. No, sorry, it's flicked on a bit. Norman West, right, our pilot, Norman West. I found a website that had some vague reference to losses of Lancaster bombers, and there was a mention of JB-141, and this chap called Anthony West said, my father was the pilot on this one, so crikey, died, we've got to find him. So we went off hearing on him, trying to find this bloke, couldn't find him anywhere, but we knew he had a son called Nicole, who was a doctor. So I even tried to apply for a job at his hospital using that email address, didn't get anywhere, but we did get the details from the census. And here he is, because Norman Edward West, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. Now, they're all Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. They were reservists during the war. They weren't full-time members of the Air Force. As you can see, Sergeant Norman West, pilots in 1943 and the beginning of 44 were still sergeants. They were all sergeants on a Lancaster bomber. Norman did actually, by the time of the crash of the Lancaster, get a promotion to pilot officer. So when he died, he was actually a pilot officer. He had a reserved occupation. He was actually a policeman in Plymouth. And that was a lovely photograph of him on his wedding day. Quite an elderly member of the crew, 24 years old, but that sort of responsibility. As it says on here, police constable, Tony, his son, has explained why his father gave up a reserved occupation. He could have spent the war as a policeman on the beat in Plymouth, but he saw a couple of things on some occasions that basically turned him completely, and he said there's no way he could continue the war as a civilian, and he had to join the armed forces, and he volunteered for the Air Force. And this is what gets me, the statistics, 5'11" and a half, so he was quite a tall bloke, almost as tall as me, a chest size of 34 inches, waist size of 34 inches is what most people expect nowadays, but a chest size, and the other lads are very much like that as well, like sticks. But in red, stamped down here, is something that one of the researchers said was quite unusual. As soon as he was recruited, I think in the late July of 41, and almost immediately he was identified as suitable for training as a pilot or for a commission in the Air Force, not to be employed other than as a pilot or observer without reference to the Air Ministry. So he must have really impressed them, and the guy that saw this said he's only seen that a handful of times on some of the service records. And those service records, you can apply for them online. If you're a direct descendant, it's very easy. This is something I gave back to the family. Again, this was on eBay. It's a training course in Canada, 59 war course. And these are all young men trained to be pilots. And sat cross-legged in the front is Norman West. So the family had a photograph that they'd not seen before. So I could give some back to them. And in fact, Tony, Norman's son, gave me a whole album of photographs, which is fantastic, of all his training, all the ship journeys off to Canada and stuff. It was a fantastic record. So we've got our second named member of the crew. In the middle there, Norman West, the pilot. Oh, John Joey Smith. Very sensitive, this. Very sad. John Joey Smith, young lad, he's the mid-upper gunner, local to Lincoln, RAF Wickham, where 626 Squadron were based. It's just outside Lincoln. So he would have known Wickham, he would have probably cycled along there. And at Branston Booth's Village Hall, there's actually a plaque to Joey's is known to the family, and some others who died during the war. But the most poignant bit is the brass plaque above, because the brass plaque above mentions Private John Smith, who died 22 years old, died in 1918 in the First World War. Underneath is Private Joseph Smith. Their mother had a young boy in 1924, 25, a good few years after her teenage boys had been killed, and she named the boy John Joseph after his two dead brothers. Because he was under 21 when he joined up, his father had to sign the documents to allow him to be recruited by the RAF. And the day that Joey's mother found out that he'd died, she threw her husband out of the house, and he was never allowed back across the threshold. 20 years old. Can you spot him? There he is, John Joey Smith. Arthur Dinger Bell, another local lad to Lincoln. It's a very, anyway, that was supposed to show the convoluted path that we found the relatives for Arthur Bell. We found a reference to Arthur Bell in a will. Now that's a fantastic resource for doing any research, because in a will, anybody you mention, you've got to mention who they are, the date of birth, where they're living, whether they're alive or dead, or what have you. So we were using a will of a distant cousin of Arthur's, and we eventually found a distant cousin on the other side. Tried to get in contact with them, couldn't find any names, but we had a couple of addresses of somebody who might be alive. So we wrote letters and used snail mail with a copy of the poem saying, please get in touch, we'd like to know. A lady actually went to visit her father who just died, his house, opened the door, and my letter was on the doorstep. So fortunately she caught it just in time and got back in touch with me, and immediately showed me this photograph of Arthur. And he was a family hero, so even though he was a distant relative, she knew all about Arthur. And as with all of these young lads, you will always see a report in a local paper announcing that they're missing, or announcing that they're dead. Arthur was 22 years old. There he is, Arthur Dinger Bell, our navigator. George the Baron Upfold, how dramatic does that sound? The Baron. Whoa. And that's George the Baron Upfold. This was Halifax. He was from Halifax, Greekland. And I used to do work in Halifax, so I got in touch with some friends on Facebook who went to local history forums for Halifax and said, does anybody have any knowledge of this person? And within a few days, I'm doing this in a hurry. This took months. It took weeks, it took months. And every time you got this contact, the woman that was reading the poem as I was typing to her, she was in tears. she could hardly concentrate on the conversation. He was a member of the Halifax Bohemian Players, and I wonder whether he'd done a bit of amateur dramatics, and he had this persona of being the Baron. I don't know. Nobody knows why he was called the Baron, but I like to think he possibly played the Baron in pantomime one Christmas. Who knows? He was in the Boys Brigade, and I have actually been into the Boys Brigade church hall to actually take a photograph of the plaque. He was 21 years old. And there he is, George the Baron Upfold. And you can tell he's a rear gunner, and I'll tell you about that a bit later on because of what he's wearing. John Stanley. Now, as Di said in that piece that she did, Mary Stanley's daughter was the first contact I had, and it was so promising. She said, "Oh, crikey, you know, I've got photographs of my uncle. There's so much I'd love to share with you." And then everything went quiet for the whole research, for doing all, and it wasn't just a case of doing research on the other members of the crew. It was having other people coming to me thinking that their relatives were on the crew and having the disappointment saying, "Sorry, but you know, I'd love to have your relative on the crew, but he couldn't have been there." And it wasn't until an event that I organised back in 2024 that I saw Liz again. And again, here we are. Sorry, I forgot to say, with Norman, of course, Norman West. He had a son. Norman's wife was also pregnant, pilot. So Tony never met his father. But this is a typical view here where you've got John Stanley and his sister's daughter, Elizabeth. And she's no longer a Downing, of course, she's changed her name to Alte. But when I did actually meet up with her, and she brought a fantastic range of photographs, because John himself had been nominated for training as a pilot, and he did his pilot training in Dallas. She had lots of, take as many photographs as you want. I thought, well, I'll only take one or two of them, because every photograph I could find of John had a different girl on his arm. And you can see why he's a dashing young man, and I think this is the main reason for my mum being so enamoured about getting to this party and writing a poem for them. And you can see that John came back, he didn't have his pilot wings, but he did have his observer's brevet, or half brevet, which is the symbol with the wing on it. So he came back, better qualified than many. Amongst some of the photographs that Liz gave me, there's John, but there's also Norman, our pilot, and Arthur Bell, the navigator. So it was lovely finding these things. And that photograph could only be 1.5 inches, 2 inches tall. You scan them as highly as you can. John was 20 years old when we lost him. So that is our penultimate member of the crew. So it leaves just one left. And that's George Powell, the senior member of our crew. 33 years old when he died. We found all sorts of bits and bobs, because it was desperately difficult to actually find details of George. But then when we did, it all started flowing in. We found out that he was a publicity driver. He was actually a special constable. When he died, he left behind him a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old son. So again, there was that direct lineage that we could contact and deliver the poems to. And whilst doing some of the research, that's his great-grandson. And I think you'll agree that the genes in the family are pretty strong. I couldn't believe it when I saw this photograph, that, you know, it looks like a younger George. So that's George Powell, flight engineer. And there we are. The cream of our land is displayed. Uniform, there we are. Big question, uniform. Uniform suggests that everybody's wearing the same thing, but as you can see quite clearly from this photo, I've got my pointing stick, but I'll just stand over there. They're all wearing something different. At the end there, our rear gunner, George the Baron Upfold, that's a Taylor buoyancy suit that he's wearing, which means that basically once you jump in the water, you could hopefully float as long as there's no tears in it. You can see it's either electrical heating socket or the communication device on the side hanging down. Because, you know, you were sub-zero temperatures, 20,000 feet above the ground, in the back of this aircraft with no heating. You could actually plug yourself in. you'd actually give yourself electric shock occasionally because they weren't that reliable. I only found out today that the Taylor buoyancy suit was favoured by rear gunners. Rather than jumping back and getting your parachute and you could just jump out of the aircraft and hopefully when you landed you were in the water and you would survive. That's why rear gunners like them, and it was that extra layer of insulation. John Stanley and Norman West are both wearing these. Now this is the liner from inside a Sidcot suit. Sidcot suit was that suit that you saw Norman wearing, the big canvas thing. They were told not to wear them because they could quite easily absorb aviation fuel, and they were a fire hazard. But clearly, these guys thought that they were the ideal thing to wear. They're wearing their battle dresses. Of course, John's wearing a tie. why wouldn't you wear a tie when you're flying in a Lancaster bomber? You can see their battle dress, their serge battle dress poking out. A couple of them have got roll neck jumpers and the odd cravat just to give that certain bit of flair. Joey down the bottom and George are both wearing their battle dress blouses with just jumpers underneath, or shirt and tie according to Arthur, because Arthur's behind this screen where there is heating in the Lancaster, so possibly he doesn't need as much protection. This is clearly a crew that had done a lot of work flying Lancaster bombers and knew what suited them best, what they preferred to wear. And Cyril, on the end here, is actually wearing an Irving jacket, a lovely leather sheepskin coat. Keith's grandparents, so that's Cyril's parents, would tell Keith that when the bodies were recovered from Germany, the Americans got hold of Cyril because he was wearing a leather jacket because they thought that he was an American pilot, and they nearly took him. And I thought, well, that's a bit of fantasy maybe, but I don't know. We'll look at that a bit later. Now, the reason I've got that book up is this book here by Jack Curry, Lancaster Target it's called. One of the crew, it was George Powell's granddaughter, was it granddaughter, said, oh, could this have been a photograph of the crew the night they were killed, the 14th of January 1944? I said, well, they flew a lot of missions together, so the chances of this being of the 14th of January is slim. Until I read this book. And this book was written by Jack Curry, who was a pilot, 626 Squadron, flying out of Wickenby. And I'll just very quickly read this one section. And it blew me away when I found this paragraph. We completed Charlie 2's numbered hours by taking her to Brunswick on the 14th of January. Braunschweig was the target that night, in an all-Lancaster attack. As we lounged beside the aircraft, waiting for Cassidy to join us with the latest forecasts, so that would have been the navigator, they had a weatherman, who would give them all the weather details for going over there. Waiting for Cassidy to join us with the latest forecasts, Prothero offered round his cigarettes. Have one of my pontoon winnings, skipper. Oh, well played, George. Hey, you know, the Yanks went to Brunswick a couple of days ago. They got a hell of a pasting, lost 60, I think it was. Well, it's a long way to go in daylight, because the Americans went in daylight, we went at night. That's why Lancaster was painted black. Yeah, but I reckon they'll stir it up for us. I bet we don't half cop it. You are a cheerful little sod. A staff car drew into the dispersal, and the dispersal is where they would store the Lancasters, where they would put all the bombs in there and fuel them up, and stopped beside the aircraft. A rain-coated civilian approached us and introduced himself as an official photographer. I'd like to take a shot of your crew with the aircraft in the background. Walker combed his fingers through his tousled hair and asked, shall we get a copy of it to send home? You can all have copies if you wish. I unzipped my Irving jacket and said, we always piddle on the tail wheel before we get on board. Would you like us to take a photograph of us doing that? The photographer smiled. That would make a nice group, certainly, but I don't think my editor would publish it. Myron grinned wolfishly. You can come with us if you like, mate, and get some action pictures. The photographer looked at me with interest, but I shook my head. No, he's only joking. I don't think we're allowed to take you. The photograph was never published anyway, because the cigarettes that Myring and I were obviously smoking, others were being held at the site, near large quantities of petrol and explosives, were far too flagrant a breach of discipline to be officially advertised. So that was an account, the only account of an official photographer going around the cruise taking photographs. And it was on the night that they left England, never to return. So I know the young woman that I was talking to, it was a bit of a flight of fantasy for her, but I think that's possibly the last time the crew were actually seen in England. Here we are. Right, as part of the research, of course, the amount of stuff that's available to you online now is unbelievable. I'll just run through some of the RAF documents that we discovered, or I discovered. First one is, that's the, it's like the V5, the Lancaster bomber. You know, this is the record of where it was made by Avro Lancaster. Yes, the Avro manufacturing company. First came to 100 Squadron in 1943, and you can see it eventually came to 626 Squadron when in January 44 it was declared as being missing. Now, the VIN number for the Lancaster, the actual identification number, is JB141. That's why I keep referring to JB141. But on the side, in big letters you'll see on the model there, there's two sets of numbers. UM, which is the code for Wickham-B 626 Squadron. So every Lancaster flying from 626 Squadron started with UM, and then they had a unique number. This was Norman 2, N2. So UMN2, that's RAF Wickham-B 626 Squadron N2. The Lancaster's VIN number was JB141. I talked about the operational records books. So for every operation, and this is the January 1944, and you can see over here it says 14th of January 44. It details the aircraft type and its number, the crew, what duties the crew were performing, then details such as this crew left at 16:41, so 20 to 5, got back at 22 minutes past 7, over target 20 past 7 that evening. So they were over Brunswick about 20 past 7. You could see the bombs that they were carrying, what height they flew at, 22,000 feet, and just various details about the bombing mission. Big line of Lancasters would head off from different air stations towards the target. There would be what they call pathfinders that would go ahead and they would drop different coloured markers. Rather than each individual bomb aimer having to try and find the target, he would just look out for these markers and then drop bombs where others had been dropping their bombs. And you know, some of them it says, you know, you could see for a couple of 100 miles before you got to the actual target. The next crew in the Lancaster 3 again, sending off 4:30, getting back just before 10 o'clock over the target, 17 minutes past 7. The final entry is Lancaster JB141 N2. Set off at 16:38, missing. Shows what bombs they were carrying, but aircraft failed to return, nothing heard after takeoff. So that's the final entry for this crew. I've been through the records. I managed to find details for all of the missions that they were flying together. They start off with 103 Squadron, but then move over to 626 Squadron, and the curator at the Wickham-B Airfield Museum, which is fantastic, brilliant little cafe underneath, and then a museum up in the old control tower. He was saying that they were probably handpicked to come to 626 Squadron. They needed new blood with experience to actually train people and get things going. And it gives details in the orbs about, you know, the one mission was abandoned because Joey Smith was unwell, so they had to turn back. And one, they were hit by flak and they had to turn around. So there's quite a bit of detail in there. And then the final one, bombing Brunswick in 44. This is when it starts to get a little bit morbid. This is the Graves concentration report form. This is the piece of paper that would have landed on a desk in Britain for this crew. There was a team called the Missing Research Establishment Section who investigated burials. Imagine you were in the Navy, you died, you got a tray out and they slid you over the side and it was recorded you were buried at sea. In the army, there'd be a diary, and you'd have some record in the diary of where you'd been shot, or somebody might have buried you and put a grave marker there. This Lancaster took off from Lincoln at 20 to 5 one evening in January, and that's the last we know about it. So this team basically went through Europe trying to find missing crew, and going through France and Belgium and Holland. It was a breeze. You know, locals would have buried any dead crew members in their graves, in their cemeteries. But of course, when you get to Germany, you know, they don't want to know about these terror fliegers, as they call them, these terror flyers. And there's records of, you know, possibly the odd tin of cigarettes being passed to the local mayor to try and get more information. And this tells us that in Heiningen, Germany, using the is it GSGS maps, Alan, you would have probably dealt with those, I don't know, 1 to 1,000, reference 4416, at that grid reference, they found 6 bodies. Now, they found these bodies probably 3 years after they'd been buried by the locals, so who knows what condition they would have been in. But the only identifiable things that they found, partial service number. Now, these service numbers would have been probably a laundry tag in a shirt or on a jacket, maybe some paperwork in them. The boots was a favourite place to actually put your service details. You didn't want somebody else nicking your boots. So they had a partial one there, bell, so it must have been a laundry marker. Unknown. Next one's a sergeant. There's quite a bit of a service number there, but no name. Next one, unknown. Next one, unknown. Next one is a sergeant. So they must have found some chevrons on a uniform. Somebody then went off and started to do the research back at this desk in Britain in 1947. And they filled in the details. Arthur Bell, 826 was the end of his service number. John Stanley, his number, they put down 515206. It was actually 1575206. So they very quickly identified which crew they found. Okay, fine, yeah, we know these are sergeants, so they can possibly say George Upfold there and John Stanley there. There's a bit of a blank there, we better put the pilot in there. So, you know, Norman West goes in there. But then, what happened to Cyril Wheatstone? Somebody made a decision that Cyril Wheatstone wasn't recovered. Well, there's an argument to say he could well have been recovered and buried in the cemetery, but we don't know. But they had to make that decision. They had 6 bodies. And this is a copy of that original British Army map, the full map. Just keep an eye on this funny shape of woodland here. It's called the Oderwald. And it will become a bit more significant as we go through. Because if you look at the grid reference, there, Heiningen. So Heiningen, which is just south of Wolfenbüttel and south of Brunswick, or Braunschweig as it's now referred to, that is where they were found. Fantastic. So we know where roughly they were. This is, it's not coming out particularly one on the screen there. This is a record card for the Lancaster that basically records the details of when it arrived and when it disappeared. It shows certain things like it had G, which is like a radar type navigation device running on the Lancaster when it was crashed. And this is the graves registration form. This shows you where, if you're ever visiting Hanover, it's for Hanover War Cemetery, where you would find the various crew members from 626 Squadron here. And this is the details that the families wanted putting on the graves. And it's quite poignant that Norman West's families asked for God's greatest gift, remembrance. And I think that's quite poignant. That struck a chord with me.